We're just waiting for the point from Gary. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a special meeting of Brant County Council. Attendance has been taken, noting that Councillor Kyle is zooming in and everyone else is present. Number 2 on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Are there any additions to the agenda the way it's written? Seeing none, I'm looking for someone to make the motion to move into Councillor Pierce, seconded by Councillor Bell, that we move into committee of a whole to this. Oh, that the agenda be approved, sorry. All those in favor? Opposed, carried. I now need someone to move that we move into committee of the whole to discuss the 2023 budget. Councillor Coleman and Councillor Oakley. All those in favor? Thank you. Declaration of pecuniary interests. Shouldn't be any. Moving on to number, oh, I've already done it. Moving on to number 4, which we've already done. Taking us now to number 5, which is the budget update. Heather Mifflin, or Heather Boyd, or both.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Your Worship. Today is our draft 2023 budget, February 21st update. We are still at the point of our budget where we're evaluating and reviewing the draft budget. And at the conclusion of the last meeting on February the 2nd, the following direction was provided to staff. Just the action clause, that the budget team review the capital budget to identify projects that may be deferred with the 5-year plan or alternatively financed. Since that, one small detail that we found was another operating budget savings of $30,000. That has been incorporated into everything we present tonight. So where we're at right now, the start of this meeting, where we ended on the 2nd, is a proposed net levy of $67,981,397. The decision packages that were approved, the operating decision packages that were approved, and the update to the blue box gets us to $71,068,238, which is a 10.1% increase on the taxes, and on the median home, a $321.03 increase. That is the operating summary where we stand today, just breaking out the decision packages that were approved into their various categories in our summary. So getting prepared for today's meeting, we did once again go through our public engagement, see if we'd had any new comments. We've looked at the draft operating budget. There's a couple of the operating decision packages that we are suggesting you may want to review going forward. We reviewed the draft capital plan, looking for projects we could defer or alternatively finance. And we also looked at our financing options to see if there's anything we could do to lower the tax levy without impacting the capital investment.
The screen is just showing one single sheet. I don't think I see that one single sheet anymore.
No, so the screen she was showing was all the proposals, like a summary. If you want to follow along with your presentation materials, or we can put the presentation up.
This is a summary sheet, though.
Yep, that's fine.
Sorry, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, yep, we'll go through it that way, and then we'll put that summary back up.
Sorry about that.
Nope, no problem. Just one note when we're going through these options, when I say impact to taxes for each proposal, that is the impact of just that proposal. So we do look at a cumulative effect at the end there, but each one is just, if that was the only thing we did, that would be the change that it makes. Oops. Public engagement results, so we haven't had any additional questions or comments, and we didn't get any after I published the presentation either. So after we get through the budget process, there is a slide presentation on communications that will be presented for their committee's consideration. Here is the public engagement summary results. This is the report we pulled from Engage Brant. I think copies of the full report were provided to you in your packages just so you could look through it. But this is the highlights. 192 people visited our budget public engage site, and looks like we just had the one actual comment in question. So where we are, once again, still where we are, the decision packages that we approved on February 2nd, they're all listed here. I'm not going to go through them, but I'm sure you've read through them all. And the operating decision packages are these ones. So getting into the proposals that staff have looked at. So the first one we are suggesting in talking with our staff that working on the automated speed enforcement program is moving the provincial offenses officer to have a zero impact on taxes for 2023. It won't stop the position going forward. It doesn't stop the program from going forward. It just recognizes that that position should be on a cost recovery basis, and it'll be reviewed for 2024 if it doesn't look like that's going to be cost recovery. And if by chance the program doesn't get started this year, then the position won't get filled until that program starts. The second proposal is that we make a reduction in our investment in physician recruitment for 2023. That program is just going to be getting started this year. We won't have a full year salary for the person. There won't be full year impact. So we're saying that by the time everything gets started, we're looking at maybe $100,000 this year, and then clearly the full $200,000 will be needed for 2024 decision. Okay, so this is the one that needs a little bit of explaining. Potential capital budget savings. So when we presented on February 2nd, there was two decision packages for capital investment. One at approximately 1.9 million and one at 1 million. So those are the two levels. We did feel that it was really important that we brought forward an increase in our capital tax levy investment so that we don't end up in the situation where now it's been 3 or more years that we haven't made an increase in that. And on February 2nd, committee recommended that we go with the 1.9 million investment. They also approved 7 other capital decision packages, which total $500,000. So these are just the projects that we had determined that we could do with the 1 million, but we're not going to make it between the 1 million and 1.9. So if we had 1.9, sorry, that was backwards. If we approved the 1.9, these projects were in. If we had gone with the 1 million, these projects were going to be out. So these were the ones that staff had already identified that could be deferred for 1 year without a major impact to our capital program. So what I'm recommending is that or what I propose is that the capital levy remains at the 1.9 as approved by committee last meeting, but that the 500,000 in also approved decision packages be built into that. So that would mean one project would need to be deferred, which would be the Curtis Avenue North, and then we would keep 50,000 in there to start the work on that project for 2024. So that saves us a total of $500,000 in savings. It does also make sure that we do make that significant investment in the capital tax levy. And I don't know if I'll just leave it to you if anybody has any questions about that. I know the slides might be a little complicated. It made sense in my head, but maybe nowhere else.
Councillor Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Heather. Heather, haven't we deferred this once before? Wasn't this planned for 2 years ago? And we shifted it around when we were building the health hub. We decided we'd do the south end of Curtis Avenue North rather than the north end of Curtis Avenue North.
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe Rob Walton might have an answer to that.
I'll turn some.
It's dark when it's on. Red. Sorry, it's red when it's on.
Thought it was green. Okay. Through the mayor to Councillor Bell. So when the health hub was built, we did the servicing at the south end of Curtis Ave North and the first, 300 meters of street. But then the rest of this, and we did actually because we use grinder pumps, we actually have sanitary sewer at all the properties on that street now. But the storm drainage and the road reconstruction for the north part of it still needs to be done at some period of time. Not urgent, but until that's done, the project's not completed. So that was a phased project that was planned, as you said, 2 years ago, I believe. And it was planned that whether it happens in 2023 or 24, it can happen in either.
Thank you.
Any other questions so far?
So the next couple of proposals get into talking about the Brant County Power Investment Funds. I know that it has come up at committee and at council a few times over the last year about looking at using some of the principal amount of those funds to help with the capital levy. Part of staff's caution and why we haven't brought anything forward before is that, recommending use of those funds will have a long-term impact on their availability. We would like to look at using some of that as part of the long-term financial plan, maybe for things that would pay back into the fund. But we totally recognize that given this year, a small portion of these funds may be needed to bring this program into an acceptable level. So there's two proposals. The first one being that we would fund the decontamination and hygiene program. We feel like that's a high impact investment for the safety of our volunteer firefighters with a fairly significant impact to taxes. So our one proposal is that we would look at funding that from the Brant County Power Investment Fund principal amount. One thing to note, though, that does make a reduction in the capital tax levy investment. So our overall tax levy investment will be down by $600,000. It just decreases the higher starting point for next time. Proposal 4B would be if council is looking for a bigger impact on the tax levy, would be looking at doing the leachate offloading station project through the Brant County Power Investment Funds principal. That would have an impact of $1.4 million. It should be noted, though, that this reduces our capital tax levy investment by 1.4, which is almost the exact amount we gained by investing 1.9 in the decision packages. So it does have a much more significant impact on how much we're investing in our capital each year and our go-forward basis for next year.
Councillor Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Heather, you pointed out that we're going to keep on reducing the go-forward capital tax levy starting point. So we're actually going to go back to a point that we said we didn't want to be at, if I'm not mistaking that.
Yep, these are all options for council to look at in order to get to the tax levy that they feel comfortable with. I've set it up mostly as an a la carte kind of menu, so which you feel where we need to get to is what we can do to get there. That's why I said this one is a big one. This is a big impact on our capital tax levy.
Do we have if I may, Mr. Mayor, do we have any estimation of what the inflation rate will be for 2023 using the index that we do for this particular subject?
The information I got from the Bank of Canada is they are thinking this might be a 3% inflation year, but once again, there's a million things that might impact that before we get there.
Yeah, sorry if I may, Mr. Mayor, but we use a slightly different index for this one. And maybe Rob Walton knows the answer to this, because we're not in a 15.6% inflation generally, but we're going to use that number for our budget purposes. What's the equivalent forecast for this year, Rob?
I think we usually take the first quarter construction price index, which wouldn't be out yet. I'm not sure what the end of year would have been.
Do we have a forecast of that?
Mr. Walton.
We really have no idea. Like, if I gave you a number, it'd be what they call a wild ass guess.
Scientific one.
Yeah. Like it's all over the place on projects. It's so hard to predict right now, but I would have the impression it's not going to be 15 point some percent, but saying it's going to be less than 7 or 8%, I think would be a bad strategy.
So my concern, Mr. Mayor, if I may, on this one is that we will end up going back to the the starting point without 15.6, and next year we're going to have to add, I don't know, 22 or 23, whatever it compounds onto. And I think it's a dangerous precedent to set.
Thank you, Councillor Bell. Any other comments? Heather, do you want to continue?
Yep. The next couple of proposals talk about overall financing options to reduce the tax levy. So one thing that we did experience in 2021 was a higher than normal contribution into the contingency. That was largely due to some COVID funding that we weren't expecting at the time of 2021 budgeting. The purpose of the contingency is to have those funds available for emergency unexpected expenditure. So we certainly do not on any circumstance want to deplete our contingency to a very low level. Historically, we have made contributions from this reserve to help mitigate tax increases. We've done varying amounts. Those come in the next sheet. And the balance at December 2022 is about 2.3 million. So the history of contributions from the contingency to the annual budget is outlined there. That's for your information. So there's two proposals I put forward for committee's consideration. One is a contribution of $375. Impact to taxes is it brings the tax to 9.5. Only thing to really note is that this is kind of one of our key drivers from 2020. Key driver for 2023 was the fact that we done from the contingency in 2022, which increases your overall expenses, but isn't a revenue that you have every year. So it will have an impact on the base operating budget for 2024.
Councillor Bell?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Heather. Heather, I think I know the answer to the question I was going to ask. It's how do we actually refill this contingency reserve? And if I read this right, every time we draw down, the next year we have to refill with that same amount of money. Is that correct?
No, we fill it up usually with our surplus, which this was the first year we didn't have a surplus, but if we accept that as an anomaly, then it will eventually get refilled. That's how we replenish the reserve. We don't have to pay it back next year, but the thing is that if we put $375 from contingency, that's a revenue source. That goes in as a revenue, which is just a revenue from our contingency. So next year, in order to meet our expenditures, we're already $375 higher than our revenues. So it's just a difference we'll have to make up, but we don't have to pay back into the contingency next year.
So if I may, Mr. Mayor, so if we take that route on 5B and Fork together, we're already lifting the starting point for next year to nearly $2 million more than we are today.
Well, the fours don't raise next year's. They actually lower next year's because they have a less capital investment. So the capital tax, the money going into the capital program will be less next year if we do the fours. The fives increase the base operating budget.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Heather before we go to the recommendation? Heather?
Yep. So quickly, 5B is the exact same thing, only it's a much higher contribution from contingency reserve. So getting into the staff recommendation, so we looked at all these. We put forward a package for your consideration. You're welcome to take all of this, any piece of this, add in any of the other proposals, but this is what staff thinks. These are the ones that staff would recommend moving forward with. Proposal number 1 is a reduction in the operating decision package for the ASE program officer. Proposal number 2 is the reduction in the physician recruitment program. Proposal number 3 is the reallocation of the capital levy increase to include those decision packages items and the deferral of Curtis Avenue North. Proposal 4A is taking the fire decontamination and hygiene program out of the Brant County Power Reserve principal amount. And 5A, a contribution from contingency of $375, which is pretty much in keeping with what we've done in past years. Overall, cumulatively, the impact to taxes is a $1.6 million savings, brings our new tax increase to 7.6 or $241 on the median home.
Thank you, Heather. Councillor Pierce, you're first, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, I want to say thank you to staff for going back and doing all this. I might be throwing a wrench into things, and I know what the recommendation is there, but I'm going to throw something on the table if I could, Mr. Mayor. I don't know if this is the appropriate time to throw a motion on the table.
I would
What I'm
think so.
looking at is with the staff recommendations, for the rationale of the fact of, proposal number 1, we're not there yet. Proposal number 2, it's only going to be a half a year. So I would agree with, doing those two. But where I want to throw the little wrench into things here, and I know we've spoken of this fund for years and years, I would like to put a motion forward that with using the Brant County Power funds, that we do option 4A as well as 4B. Now, I totally understand that that's going to put it to about $2 million that we're taking out of that fund, but I'd be curious to know where that would put us. Because that, to me, is money, and if I may quote from the Brant County Power Investments, it says caution should be exercised adopting this option, which I think we all appreciate. But the final sentence on there, it says, be forthcoming in long-term plan to make the best possible use of this asset to benefit of the community. I think right now, in this time, in this year, that it would be the best possible use of that money for our community. So I'd be willing to put forward a motion that we keep proposal number 1, proposal number 2, and proposal number 4A and 4B, and kind of wrap that up. And I'd be interested to understand where that would put us if I were to get a seconder for that motion.
You have a seconder in Councillor Howes. Maybe staff could figure out that new number for us while we're having discussion.
Gary, can we put the other screen back up, please?
Comments? Councillor Chambers?
Just a question, and I'm not just exactly sure what is in that reserve. If someone could tell me the status of the Brant County Power Reserve.
Who knows that number?
Approximately.
Approximately 32 million.
32 million is the answer, approximately. Councillor McAlpine.
Do we know approximately what rate of return we're making on that versus what we would be paying, say, on interest if we were to actually pay for this project by borrowing the money, just for curiosity? Just around numbers.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. I want to say about 4. That's probably a bit high, so it's not. Yeah.
Any other questions? Councillor Miller, you're next.
Are we speaking to the amendment?
We're still discussing the motion.
The motion, the amendment?
Okay, so the motion's up there now as I think the committee recommendation column. So that would be the items that were included in the councillor's recommendation.
Okay, so the staff recommendations 4A, taking 600,000 from Brant County reserves. Councillor Pierce would like to see 600 and 1.4 million. I will take the opposite side of that coin and say I don't want to see any money come out of the Brant County Power Reserve. And the reason is when we start taking that money out, we're eating our seed corn. We do use the proceeds to offset tax increases. So obviously if you're taking away capital, you're going to be eating into that. You won't have as much return. At the same time, we still haven't done a long-term financial plan. We don't know how we would like to incorporate that because there is going to be opportunity, and I know this down the road, where we can take that money, use it for long-term capital projects instead of borrowing the money. So I just know that if we're taking money out of it now to get a tax increase down, we are limiting our options in the future. So just my thoughts on that. And I will just one other thing. I don't think we should go the way of Hamilton. Hamilton also got sold theirs distribution company. They also had a large capital pool. They have since spent that capital pool in a very short period of time.
Councillor Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would lean towards Councillor Miller's and Councillor Bell's concerns here that one, we're eating up a significant asset and we don't have long-term financial plan or asset management plan for that. That next year we're going to be just pushing off this large increase to next year as we're using it to eat up roughly 5% here. So instead, we're just next year going to be adding 4 to 5% if we want to maintain our increase, as we said we wanted to with this 1.9 that we approved last month. So I would be very concerned about pulling this much money out to artificially decrease our rate this year and make it a problem for next year. And then perhaps to have the precedent where we're going to just keep pushing it, which I think is what happened in the past year, which has resulted us with this 10.1 that we're looking at. So I would hesitate to support this.
Thanks, Councillor Oakley. Councillor Kyle, I can hardly see you, so if you make sure that I can see you if you want to speak, please. Councillor Pierce, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So let's look at this a different way then. Since my time on council, all we've heard about is we've got this investment, we've got this investment. All we've used out of it is the interest. And it was always stated that we need to find the appropriate thing to use that money on. So let's not look at this as using that money to bring our tax increase down. Let's look at it for using that money for for 4A, which is the proposal for the decontamination and hygiene program for our firemen. Let's look at it using that money for that purpose. Let's also look at it for using that money for the purpose of the leachate offload station, which is direly needed. Okay, so let's not look at it as using the money to bring down the tax rate. That's a bonus of using that money, but in our minds, we're using that money for these two projects, which to me are critical projects for our community, critical projects for, that are going to have to be done going forward. So let's look at it that way, that we're using that money. We have now found two perfect projects to use that money on, and an additional benefit of that, it brings our tax rate down almost 5%.
Councillor Bell, you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to be in the same position as Councillor Miller. I think it's premature for us to draw down on the Brant County Power Investment Funds. If we're going to draw down on anything, I'd rather we draw down on our contingency reserve. There is money there to do this, and I would do that in a heartbeat.
Anyone else have a comment? Councillor Chambers, you're next.
Yeah, I'm going to support both Councillor Pierce and Councillor Bell eventually with the contingency reserve, because I think there's money there to be had. With regard to the Brant County Power Reserve, I think Councillor Pierce has explained exactly why we deferred this until today to look at projects which could be used, that would make sense to use this reserve for. And Councillor Pierce has explained it very, very well. I'm trying to remember exactly how many years we've had this reserve sitting there. It's been 10 years at least, I think, maybe longer. And at a $2 million drawdown at that rate, it would last a long time. There's also the ability to replenish reserves. As long as I've been on council, I don't think there's ever been a year, it might be one or two, where at the end of the year we have not ended up with a surplus. We always have the resolution somewhere along at the end of the year where we put so much into the contingency reserve, so much to draw down debt, and we deal with what's left over that way. This reserve can be replenished if need be, along with the contingency reserve. Inflation at over 6% or whatever it is now, I don't know, is unusual for the last several years. It has not been that high, so it's an aberration. And when you have an aberration, I don't foresee inflation. It's already starting to come down a little bit. I don't see it continuing to be at that rate, which is another reason to mitigate this year and maybe next year. The other reason that I support using the reserves is, and I've always said this, that there's a huge reserve out there, and that's in the pockets of the taxpayers. If we need money, we can always get it. And to have money in our bank and not use it is perhaps not what we should be doing in many ways, because the people need the money for themselves, and having a 10% tax increase is untenable. 2 years ago or 3 years ago, having an 8% tax increase would be untenable. Recognizing that the inflation rate is 6%, keeping that in consideration, I think we can kind of shoot for that. But getting back to the resolution, I'm in full support of using what is a small amount of the Brant County Power Reserve for an extraordinary year for a good purpose, and that's why I support the recommendation. And I can probably look into my crystal ball and say at the end of this year we are going to have money left over, as we always do, thanks to the wise expenditures of our staff when they do deal with their budgets. And perhaps at that point, reserves can be replenished or debt be drawn down, etc. So it's to think that we're tapping into a sacred cow, which we're going to all of a sudden get greedy from here in the next 20 years and deplete it, is something I think is something that we won't be doing, or the people here won't be doing, just as we haven't done in the previous 10 years.
Thank you, Councillor Chambers. Councillor Bell and then Councillor Miller.
Yeah, thank you. Just to the point on the Brant County Power Investment Funds, if I recall, when we went through the capital budget and we came to the funding of Trillium Way, if I recall correctly, there was a $9 million drawdown from what we thought was going to be Brant County Power. Is that correct?
We haven't identified what reserves those are all coming from. Part of it was supposed to be development charges. We're still working on the funding for that, and there will be enough. My only caution on the Brant County Power Funds isn't the money coming out of the fund, but is that funding over $2 million of our capital program from this alternative source means that our capital investment next year is going to be lower than it was at the start of this year's budget. And that's my only comment on it.
Yeah, sorry, I'm full agreement with that, Heather, through you, Mr. Mayor, but I do think it would serve us well to get this long-term financial plan in front of us, so we could make these decisions not in the vacuum that we're trying to make them at the moment, but in the light of a considered and thoughtful look to the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Question of clarification. The two projects identified to fund with the reserve, those two projects are still going ahead, whether we fund them with this reserve or from the tax levy? That's my question.
Correct.
So, okay, they're still going ahead. All right. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, so we have an amendment on the floor. It's been seconded. Do you want to read it? It's a motion.
Through you, your worship, the current motion on the floor is that the following options be approved. Proposal number 1, reduction in the operating decision package, $38,910. Proposal number 2, reduction in the physician recruitment program, $100,000. Proposal 4A, contribution from Brant County Power Reserve principal amount towards fire decontamination and hygiene program, $600,000. Program 4B, contribution from Brant County Power Reserve principal amount towards Lechate offloading station, Paris WPCP, $1,425,000.
And I'm sorry, the numbers up there actually also reflected proposal number 3 as well in there. So if proposal number 3 isn't in there, then we'll have to provide an amended number. That's where we're at without proposal 3.
Can I get clarification from Councillor Pierce, please?
The reallocation of the 500
No, this is the number then that we're at.
Yeah, I'm just gonna confirm that what the clerk has just read is correct then? Thank you. Before we call the vote, Councillor Chambers, you want to speak to?
Could I just get clarification on what we're voting on? The resolution is the package with changes to the package.
Yes.
So if we want additional changes to the package, do we amend this or do we approve that and then
You
add
can
on,
amend
or
this
do
or
we
do a
defeat this
follow-up
and then-
resurrection. You do resolution. So you can amend this or do another resolution after this.
Okay, in my mind, I'm thinking that the packages, the amendment, or the motion should be to approve the package and amend it by adding. But having said that, I'm a little bit confused in my own mind. What I would like to talk about, and I guess I'm gonna have to put it as an amendment to the motion. I'd like to talk about the stabilization contingency reserve. And I'm thinking that additional funds can be used from that reserve to draw down the levy. And before I make that motion, I might be off topic and you might call me in order, but I just want to have some questions about this stabilization reserve to back up a motion and I'm not in my mind have a figure in mind. I have a figure in mind to reduce it to a certain percentage, if that makes sense. Having said that, my motion will be that additional funds be drawn down from the contingency reserve to be determined.
I know it's very clear to you, Councillor Chambers. It's a little muddy for me. I don't know whether that can be considered part of Councillor Pierce's or whether we have to vote on Councillor Pierce's first and come back to Councillor Chambers.
It's probably cleaner to vote on the motion.
I would think
and then
we
add
should
a different
vote on
motion.
Councillor Pierce first. Is everyone all right with, everyone's clear? All right, Councillor Bell?
So, if I may, Mr. Mayor, so if it's implicit in Councillor Pierce's recommendation that proposal number 3 is not being accepted, and that means we will go ahead and build the north end of Curtis Avenue North. That's correct.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we call the vote? All those in favor? Opposed? Oh, Councillor Kyle. Did you have your hand up in favor, Councillor Kyle?
Yes, I did.
Thank you, I'm sorry. Motion carries. Now, Councillor Chambers, are we coming back to you?
Thanks, and I'm sorry for the confusion before. I just want to talk about the contingency reserve a little bit in that on the slide that has the history of what we've taken out in the past, 2013, $800,000, 2014, $500,000. If you've got that slide in front of you, the pages aren't numbered, so I don't know which one it is. But my point is this. I'm not sure of the historical amounts of the contingency reserve in those years. To me, and I may be off on this, but it seems like they're having over $2 million is a lot of money in that reserve to what it historically has been.
Yep.
And I could be off on that.
And Heather's gonna try to pull up some of those numbers. We added 1.2 million in 2021, so we were quite a bit lower before that.
And that's my point. So in 2021, that contingency reserve all of a sudden had over $1 million added to it.
Yep.
Now track that back into 2015 and 2014. We were taking $500,000 out of a contingency reserve that didn't have nearly 2 point whatever it is $1 million in it. So as a percentage of the contingency reserve that we were using to offset the levy historically has been considerably higher than taking $350,000 out of contingency reserve at $2.3 million. Going back to what I said before, the contingency reserve is funded by surpluses on a year-to-year ongoing basis. We put money in that from the money we have left over that we haven't spent in that year. And there's two things to be realized from that is that almost every year we have money left over. We don't overspend. We don't have a deficit, so we don't lose our contingency fund. We're always putting money in it. And having said that, I think a lot more than $350,000 or whatever is being proposed to be taken out of the contingency reserve fund could be taken out. And what about this idea? If we put over $1 million in 2021, maybe we could take $1 million out in 2023, reduce the tax rate by 2.4% or whatever that works out to, and use the taxpayers' money that was collected prior to reduce the taxpayers' money required this year. So I would take advice from the Treasury on what a reasonable amount for contingency reserve would be and how much should be taken out of that beyond the 350 to reduce the tax rate to a more reasonable level for this year.
Okay,
Making sense on that.
yeah, I got that one. Before we go any further though, can we have the number that we put in 2021? Did you say it was over 2 million, Heather?
No, it was a little bit over $1 million. I
Just
think it was
over
like
$1 million.
1.2 roughly.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, and I hope I hit all your questions. So yes, we put in 1.2 million in 2021. Now, a good portion of that was related to COVID funding because we were drawing it in to cover our costs. Try a good number to pull across. I am a little cautious to say that we will be probably tighter at the end of this year regarding a surplus at the end of 2022, and that's why we haven't budgeted for one. Hopefully you're right and I'm wrong. I don't know that I'd go much over 500,000 to pull in. Now you're wanting to see what that number does. Is that what you want to see? Again, similar to what Heather Boyd has already said, the more we put in, the more we're going to have to either continue to put in next year or find a different revenue source.
Councilor Chambers?
Yeah, and I've heard it said by a few people that by reducing the amount we have to raise this year, if our base budget is the same next year, we've got to raise it. So it's robbing Peter to pay Paul this year to pay next year. The converse of that is that inflation, if it reduces by 3% next year over this year, that takes care of that. The pressure on the budget this year is inflation at 6 point whatever percent it is, and that's applied to a huge portion of our budget staffing right off the hop. That's a huge impact on what we have to raise. So looking in 2024, if the inflation rate is 3%, then that 3% on the wage line is not as dramatic as a 6% on the wage line. So we don't have to raise as much for that particular line in the budget, which is our big line. And it's a line that we need to keep up. I'm not saying that we ever want to reduce that below inflation, because that's what makes this municipality work, is our staff. But just using the figures, that's why I'm not too worried about taking maybe more out of the contingency reserve this year because of that, the aberration of such a high inflation rate this year as opposed to last year, and hopefully as opposed to next year. Even if it's 4% or 3% or 5%, we don't have to raise as much. What can really happen, what would be the worst case scenario, is if inflation continued to rise and rises to 8%, and then that defeats the argument I just made and makes it that much worse. But I don't think, from what I hear, and I'm not an economist, but inflation is on the way down rather than on the way up. I don't have a problem
I hope you're right.
taking a larger amount out of the contingency reserve than $500,000. I think it can be offset the inflation this year and be recovered next year.
Mr. Lee wants to speak to that.
Sorry, through Mayor Bailey to Heather's comments around what might be appropriate to draw from the contingency. I guess my comments would be that in years where you are making a significant drawdown of the contingency, you really need to plan for a surplus at the end of the year. So every decision we make as an organization going out through the year, we're going to have to be mindful of that because we really do need to replenish that contingency. So discretionary expenditures, in-year approvals, positions that might come up through the year, all those things we'll have to look at very, very carefully. But you really want to plan on having that surplus because you do need to replenish it. So I think we as an organization would be mindful going through the year. Every time we have a difficult expenditure, we need to be looking out to the end of the year like we are always doing, but we really need to plan on generating that surplus.
Councillor House.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, and just as part of this discussion, I'm supportive of where Councillor Chambers is going with this, and I'm trying to, and I'm far from an economist also, but I'm trying to keep it in everyday terms. The contingency fund is a piggy bank that has money put into it, often from surplus from taxpayer money, as Councillor Chambers pointed out, that we didn't fully spend each year. 2021 was an exception with a $1.2 million injection of found money that was not taxpayer money. I think it might be a fair argument to conservatively take half of that $1.2 million, $600,000, to offset our current tax levy pressures. I'm just wondering if Councillor Chambers would be comfortable with that amount of money.
Councillor Chambers.
I wouldn't want to play poker with Councillor Howe. Actually, it's a judgment call. It's whether you're conservative thinking or radical thinking. In my experience, again, going by history, and as what Daryl says, if you don't have a lot of money, you're more mindful of not spending it when something comes up in the middle of the year. If you have a big pile of money there and something comes up, oh, take it out of the contingency reserve. We don't even think about it, just take it out of the contingency reserve. Well, maybe we've got to rethink those kind of ways we think. And again, the treasurer is saying 5, and Councillor House is saying 6, and I'm saying 1. Yeah, I feel comfortable in that, but it's like a reverse auction. Maybe I don't know what's appropriate.
Thank you, Councillor Chambers. Councillor Bell, you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will sit with Councillor Chambers on this one. I think $1 million, if it was given to us for COVID relief, this is one of the lagging effects of COVID, and I think it's a very appropriate place to use it. I do have a question though that maybe Daryl would have the answer to. I think there's a lagging effect on staff salary increases. I think we benefited this year. I think the union rate increases were relatively small, and I think there'll be a lagging effect. So I think we're going to find a bigger impact in 2023. I know that's a discussion ongoing in the health unit where we had a very low annual increase this year, but it didn't feel the full effects of inflation this year, so it will come next year. So adding those two things together, I still feel very comfortable about using the $1 million that we were given in 2021. And if we need to make a motion to do that, I would certainly support Councillor Chambers' motion with that number attached to it.
Is there any more discussion before we have a motion brought forward? Councillor Chambers? Here. I was just wondering what you were watching on Channel 13 there. All those in favor?
A former counselor once said, you got to shear the sheep, not skin it. 4.4 is very reasonable. Maybe that's too reasonable, but I can handle.
Councillor McAlpine first, then Councillor Pierce.
I think I'd be concerned about putting that much money. I much more prefer around the 500,000 because next year we're going to have to make up that amount when it comes to tax time, and we're also going to be facing other expenditure growths in our. We're going to be another $1 million towards social services, is my understanding. We're also going to have to put in another $1 million towards our construction costs budget, I think, next year. So sometimes it's easier to put a little bit bigger one forward this year, knowing that we can adjust it next year. It looks like this year we might not be going into a recession as well, so I think it might be a year that we could absorb a little higher increase. So I would prefer to stay at, say, 500,000 rather than go into the million.
Okay, we're going to let Councillor Miller speak, and then we're going to look for the motion. So, Councillor Coleman hasn't spoke yet either. So, Councillor Miller, Councillor Coleman, then I'm looking for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A question. What possible contingencies does a typical municipality see? And Councillor Bell brought up what I thought was a good one, lagging inflation demands from the unionized staff. I also know unique to us is we're going to see social services go up because we redid the cost sharing agreement. That's going to jump this year. The grants or the monies we get from the city for the land transfers also going down. I see those things, and those are going to have big impacts on 2024. I just know in the blink of an eye, 2024 budget's going to be here, and I'm afraid if we make that number too big, we're going to be starting from a deep hole. But if I could, Mr. Mayor, I'm looking for what kind of contingencies do I not see that are out there in addition to the ones that I do see or could possibly be out there.
Are you looking for an answer?
Yeah, staff? I don't. Maybe the treasurer could help us out too. Yeah. She's.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. If contingencies is used if like a bridge fails or there's something that is unpredicted and we have no other reserve funding for, so that's usually where we use our contingency. It's depending on the size of what's in the contingency reserve is how much we end up pulling from there but we do look at multiple sources, but sometimes that may be the only place to go.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Miller. Councillor Coleman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And in a comment, there's been a lot of good discussion here this afternoon. But if you remember about 6 weeks ago, when we started this budget, I asked for 5% roughly, and it got defeated. There's only one that supported me, my fellow ward mate. Councillor Chambers wasn't here. So I'm a lot more happier at that figure I see there now. But I could live with it at the 5. giving us the opportunity to just put some money back in and see where it all rounds out. And that's what I would like to see, another line up in there. What's coming out of the contingency, what we're gonna have left, and everything else, because we're missing that. I'm a little slow some days, but I like to see the figures in front of me, and I'm not seeing the whole story.
I think what's in front of you is showing the whole million. I don't know what's left there, a couple 100,000. It's changed now? Oh, 600's there now.
Sorry, if we took out the million, our contingency balance would be 1.374.
Councillor Pierce.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So if that's on there right now, by taking the 600 out of the contingency, that gets Councillor Coleman's 5%. Am I reading that correctly? See that, Brian?
That's a true statement? Yes. Yes, 600 gets you 5%. Any other discussion? Looking for a motion, Councillor Chambers?
I'm sure Councillor Coleman will maybe second this motion. If I read that correctly, taking $600,000 brings the tax levy to 5%.
Yes.
So I will suggest 600,000, bringing the levy to 5%. And I just want to make one comment with regard to contingencies again. We're a little bit lucky maybe if there is a disaster, if there is something where we need $1 million to fix a bridge. Don't forget we have a huge contingency in the Brant County Power Reserve that we can draw on for contingency purposes if need be. So we're not going to be bankrupt if something happens where we would use the contingency fund. So having $1 million in the contingency fund is really like saying we've got 33 million in a contingency for something that may happen. So contingency is maybe the wrong word for that particular reserve. But anyway, I'm looking at, I certainly would like a tax increase of 4.4, but I'm not sure that would pass. So I'll say the resolution would be for 6, and I think that will pass.
Recognizing we're in the middle of a conversation, I'm hoping that Councillor Coleman seconded your motion so we can talk about it. So it's on the floor, it has a seconder. Are there any other comments or concerns? Councillor Bell?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to be clear about what we're approving here, we're approving the change of the contingency rate stabilization reserve to 600,000, not the total, not the 5%. We're not agreeing 5% yet.
I think doing the 600,000 gets us to 5%.
But we're not agreeing to the whole story yet. It's just, we're not done. This is
we haven't seen the grand total yet.
no, but because I think that I would like to add one more amendment, but it will not affect the financial statement this year, but it will affect the starting point for next year.
Okay. Noting that, we'll call the vote. All those in favor? Opposed? And carried. Councillor Bell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And it really, it's coming back to the drawdown on 4A and 4B that I think is now baked into this cake. So we're going to draw down $2 million from the Brant County Power funds. I would like it that as a part of our final motion that we agree that the starting point for next year for capital levy will ignore that, and it will assume that we continue as we were before, that we would have 15.6% as the starting point of an addition to last year's capital levy. Otherwise, we're going to have a huge capital levy increase next year of probably 25%. And I think that would be a poor place to start. So I really would like it recorded that we took a very conscious decision to take money out of Brant County Power, but we're not ignoring the fact that we year on year want to increase our contribution to from the capital levy, because otherwise we will not meet our asset management targets.
Councillor Chambers.
Yeah, and I see exactly where Councillor Bell is going, and he's on the right track. And Councillor Bell is several times talked about a financial plan that we need to put in place, and those kind of discussions are part and parcel of that discussion we need for an overall financial plan with strategy going forward, and that should be number one on the list of things to do after we pass our budget. So it's a point well taken, and a discussion that will be equally as good, if not better, than the discussion we just had.
4%. Yeah, Councillor Bell, can you repeat your motion?
Try and get it right if I can.
Can I suggest some wording?
Sorry, thank you, Heather.
You're
Thank you very
welcome.
much.
I would say that the 2024 budget direction start with a capital levy increase of $2,025,000.
Yeah.
Recognizing the alternative funding in 2023.
Yeah, thank you.
You're good with that? Seconded by Councillor Miller. Any more discussion? All those in favor? Oh, Councillor McAlpine.
I just wanted to just see if I got this straight. Okay, so by doing that, okay, we're sort of baking in, but I think we were talking about doing another million on top of that next year. So we're not really getting ahead of where we should be next year. Would that be right?
That's just one piece of the budget direction. There will also be the asset management plan's going to play into it. Our financial plan will play into it. So it's just one small piece of the starting budget direction for 2024. But it is good to acknowledge it in the direction.
Okay, that's fine.
Councillor Bell?
If I may, just the reason I want to bring this forward is that it happened before my time on council, that the previous council, must be the 2014-2018 council, took a very wise decision and said we were going to increase capital levy year on year and year in line with the inflation fund on whichever index we used. Last year we walked away from it. This year we should have put it right. Now we're walking back again from it. So we need to make sure that we start from the right point. Otherwise we'll build up a snowball effect of capital that we don't have to address things that we do need to do.
So we have a motion on the floor. It's been seconded. Councillor Kyle, you ready to vote? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. That takes us to number 6, communication strategy. Allison.
No, actually, Councillor Bailey. Next thing we need to do is the actual budget recommendation to approve the budget.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So if with your leisure, if we could take like a 5-minute recess so that we can make sure we have it nailed down and present it, that would be appreciated.
Gary, we're out of recess. Thank you. Heather, do you want her to read the motion or the clerk to read it?
Through your worship to council, the motion is as follows, that the 2023 operating budget for the county of Brant totaling $67,804,328 be approved, that the 2023 capital budget for the county of Brant totaling expenditures of $96,489,207 be approved, that the capital levy of $12,176,311 funding from reserves of $30,205,677 and funding from debt and dependitures of $35,112,850 and that $279,845 in capital expenditures related to studies no longer eligible for funding from development charges as a result of Bill 23 be funded from the contingency reserve to be repaid if an alternative funding source becomes available.
And I think we should have a recorded vote.
We need a mover and a seconder.
Put it on the floor. Councillor Oakley, you're going to put it on the floor. I need a seconder. Councillor Bell. Recorded vote, please.
All right, Mayor Bailey.
I support it.
Councillor Bell. Councillor Chambers. Councillor Coleman. Councillor Garneau.
Support, just noting the conflicts with social services and John Noble Home, please.
Councillor Howes.
Yes.
Councillor Kyle.
Support.
Councillor McAlpine.
Support.
Councillor Miller.
Yes.
Councillor Oakley.
Yes.
Councillor Pierce.
Yes.
The vote is 11 yes, 0 no. The motion carries.
Thank you. Thank you for all the hard work. Council, thank you for making a good afternoon of discussion. I think we all learned a lot. I know I did. Takes us to number 6, please, on the agenda, which is communication strategy, Allison Newton.
Thank you. Through you, your worship. There's been 4 slides, I believe, that were just. Is that better? Okay. Through your worship, there are slides that were distributed to you, just outlining the intent, tactics, and key messaging that we would promote after budget approvals. If there's anything there that you would like changed or added, just let me know. Otherwise, we'll proceed on that plan.
Are there any questions for Allison right now? Seeing none, maybe later. Thank you. Takes us to number 7, staff reports. 7.1, Heather.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, this is just for the creation of the Development Engineering Reserve Fund, so it is treated just like the Building Reserve Fund. I'll take questions if.
Can I get someone to put it on the floor, please? Councillor Pierce and Councillor Coleman. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Next step, Heather Boyd.
Actually, I don't believe that step is needed at this point. These recommendations from the committee will be going to council next week for ratification.
Thank you. We have nothing in camera, which takes us to, I need a motion to reconvene as Councillor Oakley and Councillor Pierce. All those in favor? We sit back as council. The only thing left to do is to adjourn, and we have another meeting of tonight at 6. So looking for a motion to adjourn. Counselor Oakley, thank you. Well done. I wished it was 4.4, but we have no, it was 4.4, but you know what? Then but we do have to be aware of it all the time, every single time now. We can- Tomorrow.
Emergency management training.
Yeah.
I think it turned to be. So the evening sessions canceled.